Hello there and welcome to Labour Media. You lot seem to like my last video on liberalism, so I'm here with a follow-up to go more in depth about the micro-liberal philosophy. Today I want to start what might be a series of videos, potentially, wherein I debunk the myths that permeate throughout liberal thought. And what better way to do that than by taking the issue directly to a popular mouthpiece of liberal ideology. Kurzgesagt is a fun little education channel that covers topics across science and politics with cute animated bird things. They also have videos on ants, which are the best ones, and I will not be taking criticism on this. Ants are cool. I like ants. What was I thinking about? Despite the educational value of this channel, they're still very centrist and very liberal. They've dipped into this past with their video on the value of the EU that didn't really go into the more unsavoury aspects of the Union, or the video about defeating climate change that came with some fallacious optimism, and nothing too big, just some small mistakes. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about a video where they stooge for the legacy of colonialism and use long debunked eugenicist ideology to explain away the problems of poor nations. Oopsie daisy. Today we'll be looking at Kurzgesagt's video on overpopulation in Africa to explain the many levels on which it is wrong and debunk this idea of overpopulation in the process. Before we start, disclaimer, I'm not from Africa, obviously, so my perspective is limited. The topic of Africa is a very complex one, as Kurzgesagt would agree. However, the pseudoscience of overpopulation must be combated wherever it rears its ugly head. Further reading will be found in the description as per. Before we get started on the video, let's establish some groundwork as to why overpopulation is bunk. Overpopulation, as it exists today, can be traced back to the pseudoscientific quackery of Thomas Malthus. Malthus alleged that overpopulation was creating scarcity, that too many resources are being used by a surplus population. Indeed, it's this line of thinking that partially inspired Dickens' Scrooge, so we know this guy's going to be a laugh riot. This is absurd on its face. The world by no means faces a crisis of overpopulation. In terms of food, the world produces 1.5 times the amount needed, according to a study by the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture. To quote the study, hunger is caused by poverty and inequality, not scarcity. For the past 2 decades, the rate of global food production has increased faster than the rate of global population growth. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the world produces more than 1.5 times enough food to feed everyone on the planet. That's already enough to feed 10 billion people, the world's 2050 projected population peak. But the people making less than $2 a day, most of whom are resource-poor farmers cultivating unviably small plots of land, cannot afford to buy this food. This level of production, wherein what is produced far exceeds population, is not limited to food production. Vacant housing in the US alone far and away exceeds the homeless population, and similar trends can be seen worldwide. Overpopulation is not an issue. There is not an issue of scarcity in regard to satiating the needs of the earth. So, why is there still such exploitation of the land? The current environmental crisis very much shows such. What we see here is the problem of overproduction, not overconsumption. Capitalism produces, as stated above, more than is needed. This mass production, brought on by production for the purpose of both need and exchange, as well as the socialisation of labour, wherein workers produce goods socially rather than alone for the sake of exchanging those goods rather than making those goods for themselves, combined with the inability of many to afford these goods, equals out to mass waste and mass exploitation of the land, including deforestation, overgrazing, the planting of cash crops, and the mass use of fossil fuels. The issue of there being too many people on Earth who are using up all the resources on the Earth is patently false. The systems of capitalism necessitate this exploitation in the pursuit of ever-increasing profit. Now we've gone over the liberal fantasy of overpopulation, let's look at this video and why it's hilariously wrong. I aim to be as fair as possible, so if you think I'm trying to take the channel out of context, you're welcome to check out the video, link in the description.
The big picture conceals the details. Let's look at one region in particular, Sub-Saharan Africa. In 2019, it was home to 1 billion people living in 46 countries. Although its growth rate has slowed down in the last few decades, it's still much higher than in the rest of the world. While some projections expect around 2.6 billion people, others reckon with up to 5 billion by 2100. Such growth would be a huge challenge for any society. But Sub-Saharan Africa is also the poorest region on Earth.
So, right off the bat, we have a good couple problems. Firstly, let's address the term Sub-Saharan Africa. Kurzgesagt admits later this is a very silly and unhelpful idea.
Sub-Saharan Africa is a made-up idea, and in many ways an unhelpful one. Botswana is as far away from Sierra Leone as Ireland is from Kazakhstan, and they have about as much in common.
Despite this, they continue to use the term. The term Sub-Saharan Africa is one used to describe, as the video mentioned, 46 countries. However, some uses of the term have it describe 48. The African Union, on the other hand, doesn't use the term at all. Indeed, the term Sub-Saharan Africa has a racist history. Columbia University professor Brian Larkin pointed out how the term replaced phrases such as tropical Africa or black Africa, terms that consider the north of Africa more developed and thus more white than the south. To quote Wake Forest University scholar Tatinda Mashanda, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, it divides Africa according to white ideas of race, making North Africans white enough to be considered for their glories, but not really white enough. It is a way of saying Black Africa and talking about Black Africans without sounding overtly racist. So yes, Sub-Saharan Africa is at best unhelpful and at worst racist as a term. But we're not done with this opening yet. The aforementioned clip sets up two arguments: that this region of Africa is too poor to deal with a massive population spike, and that overpopulation causes poverty. The second can be derived from this image here, when the narrator references the issues of overpopulation. The issue shows deforestation, traffic congestion, food poverty, and waste being pumped into the ecosystem. So let's look at these one at a time. Traffic is a problem of cars and is much worse in places such as the US, yet we don't see that country being accused of overpopulation. Funny. It is symptomatic of a neoliberal capitalism that has thoroughly ravaged hitherto existing public transport networks. Just look at the lasting effects of rail privatisation and bus deregulation in Britain. Traffic has only gotten worse. The proliferation of cars is terrible for the environment and for people, and while some will always be necessary, public transport should be ramped up massively to counter it. Overpopulation has nothing to do with it. Food poverty is also symptomatic of capitalism, the system which increasingly exploits workers in pursuit of higher and higher profits. It's especially so in Africa because of present exploitation by Western governments and MNCs, as well as the legacy of colonialism. We'll touch on this video's presentation of that topic when it arises. Waste entering the environment is again the product of deregulation and capitalism pursuing profits at the expense of everything else. Deforestation is mainly the product of overgrazing, destroying swaths of forest for livestock and cash crops that overuse nutrients in the soil counter to the original forest. I didn't think I'd have to give an educational channel with almost 20 million subscribers a lesson in Year 9 geography, but here we are. So none of these so-called issues of overpopulation actually stem from overpopulation. Kurzgesagt admits later that there's conflicts surrounding the relation between overpopulation and poverty. Despite this, they move on with this patently false premise anyways. Following this is a section on Asia, mainly Bangladesh. They essentially say that increased access to birth control, education and healthcare single-handedly led to Asia being on the upturn. This is a massive generalisation. Yes, education and healthcare are obviously good for people and good for the economy, but less babies being born doesn't mean the economy is suddenly going to turn around. The intersecting and complex reasons for increased economic success in any one country are reduced to the population stopped growing as much. This would be like saying that the US is the most powerful country on earth solely because of FDR's New Deal. This is a massive correlation does not equal causation stuff.
Why didn't the same thing happen everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa? Africa as a whole has made considerable progress with childhood mortality. But especially in sub-Saharan Africa, education has improved slower than in other parts of the world. And while in total contraceptive use has doubled in the region since 1990, the unmet need for modern contraception among adolescents is still at about 60%.
Here, Kurzgesagt goes over how this part of Africa isn't making the grade to the metrics of education and birth control they mentioned earlier. Now, I want to say that this video isn't anti-contraception, obviously, but we should acknowledge that giving people contraception won't just jumpstart the economy. It's something that if people want it, they should have it. It shouldn't be used as part of a government scheme to control the population, as this video implies it should be. The other point here is that of illiteracy. One particularly successful example of improved literacy rates in Africa, one that has sod all to do with population control, was that of Thomas Sankara's time as president of Burkina Faso, following their revolution against the incumbent president and against ongoing neocolonialism. Within just 4 years, the state's literacy campaign brought rates up from 13% to 73%. Now, this I wanted to keep in mind for later. The centralisation and state movement used for this campaign were the same as those used for economic projects. What brought in economic upswing in the region was not the efforts of population control, but of creating self-sufficiency in the area, building new infrastructure, redistributing land, and denying aid from organisations such as the International Monetary Fund, an organ of imperialism that gives imperialised countries predatory loans that make them dependent on the imperial core. This will be relevant when we approach Kurzgesagt's ultimate solution. Goddamn, Kurzgesagt is such a hard word to say, what the fuck?
Many sub-Saharan nations have suffered under colonization until only a few decades ago and had rough transition periods towards independence. The young nations were often ethnically heterogeneous and lacked unity. Some areas have been repeatedly racked by civil wars, military conflicts, or suffered under unstable governments, which made it really hard to expand infrastructure and healthcare. So Africa had a worse starting point than Asia. Foreign aid and how it was applied, especially during the Cold War, is also a contentious issue.
This is as much as Kurzgesagt references colonialism in this piece on poverty in Africa. Not only does it take a mere glance at the subject, but it also uses the phrase until recently, implying that colonialism in Africa is over. Considering how Sankara was assassinated only 25 years ago, I'd say that's a mild reach. Africa is still being colonised and imperialised, be it through exploitation by multinational corporations, Western invasions such as the recent US invasion of Somalia that happened just this year, colonial taxes, unequal exchange, a lack of reparations, political subterfuge, AFRICOM, etc. Speaking of which, the video also highlights civil wars and unstable governments as reasons for ongoing problems. These issues are put on the back of Africa without reference to interference from elsewhere. Wars waged against African countries by the imperial core are not mentioned. Puppet governments and assassinations of political leaders, such as how Sankara was assassinated by French colonial sympathisers, are not mentioned. Kurzgesagt presents Africa as being left to its own devices rather than as being continually colonised. The section on aid here is also important and we'll get back to it in just a second.
Okay, so what can be done? Actually, a lot. Especially investment and aid that help to build systems for education, family planning, and healthcare.
Here it is, Kurzgesagt's ultimate solution to Africa's issues: aid and investment. I say it again at the end of the video too.
Summarising, there are serious challenges ahead, but they are far from unsolvable. Sub-Saharan Africa does not need pity or gifts, but attention and fair investment. It's a region rich in resources, culture, and potential. If things go right, we'll see a turnaround similar to the one we've seen across most of Asia in the last 30 years.
According to the video, the ultimate solution to the issue of Africa's poverty is population control, something already summarily debunked here, achieved through fair, whatever that means, investment and aid. Kurzgesagt is incapable of thinking of an economic solution that doesn't require foreign aid. So, remember that bit I told you to keep in mind for later? Well, let's look more into why Sankara wanted to avoid aid. Not altogether, of course, but from many of the usual Western sources such as the IMF. To quote Sankara in a 1987 speech at a summit of African leaders, "Debt's origins come from colonialism's origins. Those who lend us money are those who colonised us. They are the same ones who used to manage our states and economies. Under its current form, controlled and dominated by imperialism, debt is a skillfully managed reconquest of Africa, intended to subjugate its growth and development through foreign rules. In this era of dominance of financial capital, debt is at the forefront of imperialist exploitation. What Africa needs is autonomy. It needs control over its own resources." Instead, the video propagates the very system that keeps Africa dependent on its oppressors, promoting the system of vultures that keep the continent poor and encouraging a myopic ideal of population control in place of economic and social emancipation. So, we see this video serves as a prime example of how overpopulation is a liberal myth that serves to distract from the issue of capitalism and imperialism. We've also seen how liberals cannot identify a solution to poverty in Africa that involves autonomy for Africa. Rather, their solution is one of population control, one that gives merely a brief mention to colonialism and instead puts the weight of Africa's issues on Africa. It does not account for what has and what is being inflicted upon Africa, but calls for further exploitation. Regardless of intent, what's said is said. As a final note here, I'd like to draw your attention to the end of the video that mentions how it was made possible by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, of course, I don't think Bill Gates sat down and helped write the script. Hell, they probably didn't even speak to the man without a few levels of intermediary. But it must be considered. Ultimately, the message of this video was brought to you by a billionaire. It's not a message contrary to Bill's wishes. This is more or less a billionaire's opinion on how Africa should be run. The wealth of Bill Gates, and indeed all billionaires, is the wealth that should belong to Africa. The parts of Microsoft products are derived from Africa and other similarly imperialized regions. Africa is not poor because it can't control its population. It's poor because it's been plundered and continues to be plundered by the very countries, orgs, and individuals that now want you to think they hold the solution for the ills they created. Thank you for watching. As per transcripts and sources all in the description. Oh, blimey. Kind of records my haste, but I think, basically, I'm quite proud of the script. I'm quite proud of this video, and I hope everything. I'm recording this for like, of course, I'm recording this for I have to edit the, you know what I mean. I hope I didn't talk too fast, but as always, transcript is available if I talk like this. I can't understand what the hell I'm saying. I must sound drunk. I'm not drunk. I'm only drinking this Diet Coke. I'm actually not drunk. I'm not out of my bloody mind. Mostly. Right, so yeah. That's that one. That video. Hope you enjoyed. Anything else? I don't think so. Right. This has been Labour Media, and remember, Labour conquers all.